Hi guys, and welcome to the second reading of Smart's text. And we've gone through and we've had a look at what the identity theory thesis is, or what identity theory is, by looking at what it is not. And now we're going to positively develop an understanding of what identity theory is. So that means we're going to tell people what it is rather than explain what it is not. All right. Our overall goal is to explore how Smart positively develops his identity theory thesis this time, which means we're going to have to name, define, and interrelate different key terms like we always do, because that's how we develop theory. Then we're going to explore a summary of how the identity theory can be developed by explaining what it is rather than what it is not. And then we're going to read and trace his positive development of the identity theory thesis. So we discuss a summary and then we do the reading. That's what we're going to do. Write these down, score yourself out of 4 for each of them, and then after that, for an APK, can you just draw a picture of our nation that is Australia, and that'll become a bit obvious as we move through the summary. Cheers. Okay, so in this section, Smart is trying to positively develop his hypothesis. Rather than point out what it is not, he wants to point out what it is. And this hypothesis, or this thesis is probably a better way to say it, is really a thesis about the brain and sensation being two sides of the same ontological coin. In other words, they're the same thing. Sensation equals brain process. All right? And that's what he's trying to develop, but in a positive way. Says this is what it is, rather than saying this is what it is not. So it's worth noting too that throughout the whole text, sensation is referred to in a very broad term. We can refer to it as aspects and experiences of consciousness as well as sensation, right? And of course, when we talk about sensation, the language of sensation will be very close to the language of perception, but from now on, we're just going to call it sensation. And this is what we can say about identity statements or the identity theory statements, all right? That any mental state X is identical with some brain state Y, all right? Represented in a pictorial way, all right? X equals Y. Playing chess requires some kind of brain process because there's mental processes going on, which are underpinned by the brain process. In fact, the two are the same thing. They're just different sides of the same coin. Okay. So, for example, if I have the experience of pain, that's nothing but nerves firing in my brain. That is what the identity thesis is all about. Take a note. But philosophically, we've got to ask ourselves, what does that actually mean? I mean, we know that if I have mental state X, that means I have mental state Y. They're the same thing. What we'll find out was basically they're the same thing ontologically, though we use different language to explain the different sides of the coin. All right. So what does this actually mean? Well, pain, after images, right? They're not the same. They don't have exactly the same meaning as the brain process. That's not what he's saying. He's not saying when we talk about pain or when we talk about the after image, we mean exactly the same thing as the brain process. So write that down. Pain or sensations don't have the same meaning as brain processes, not at all. Instead, when we report about sensations, we're also reporting about brain processes as well. Take a note. Right, so when we report about what's happening with our sensation, we're also reporting about our brain processes. Both use different logic. In other words, the language of how mental states work, or the language of how sensations work, is very different from the language and the logic used to describe what happens in the brain. So both have different logic. So what we're going to say is that because they use different logic, they use different language. The language is very different to explain the different sides of the phenomena. So what he's saying is that sensations and brain states or brain processes, they don't have the same semantic identity, and semantic means language identity. They don't have the same, I shouldn't say that, I should say semantic means meaning identity. They don't have the same semantic identity. but they do have what he calls the same ontological identity. In other words, insofar as how they really exist, they are the same thing, right? But we have language that describes them different in terms of their meaning. There's a divide between what they really are in reality and the two different types of language we use to describe the different perspectives on the same process. So, for example, if we're going to describe the brain process, that language of neurology, etc., is very different from the language of how we experience the afterimage. Okay? Now, ontology is an extremely important word in philosophy. It's a metaphysical word because basically ontology is about what exists, what is real. Now, I've got two videos that you can watch in your own time if you feel you need to. This video here is a video which is about how ontology can be defined, but from the point of view of whether or not it's theoretically necessary that the component you're talking about is real. It talks about this concept of ontological commitment, which means that if your theory can only work if said object X is real, then you are ontologically committed to its existence. All right. Now, I don't really like that because there's a much broader use of philosophy in ontology, in philosophy which uses. There's a much broader use in philosophy about how we get this correct. I want to make this really clear. You know, you can just say sentences, but they're not that clear. Let's make it really clear. There's a much broader way that we can use the term ontology in philosophy, okay? And this deals with it, but it's a longer video and it is not as engaging, but it's probably a more comprehensive and accurate way of covering what ontology is in philosophy. So they're there for you to watch, but all you really need to know about ontology is that ontology is the study of existence. It's a part of metaphysics, and it's basically saying if you say something is ontologically real, then it is real. Okay? If you're saying something is ontologically identical, then you are saying in existence they are the same thing. All right? So the identity thesis isn't saying that our experience of sensations or the language you use to describe sensations or sensations are the same thing as neurons firing or our mental processes or our brain states, our brain states or brain processes. It's not saying that at all, but what's saying is that if you were to look at what's really going on here, they are. They're ontologically identical, but semantically different. You have used different language to describe them, but at the end of the day, they are the same thing, right? And he uses this because he's trying to flesh out this idea using an analogy, which is about nations. And he basically says nations are no more, not anything different to their citizens. Just like when we talk about mental states, that's no different than the brain processes. They're the same thing ontologically. Now, he's not saying in any way, shape, or form that the relationships between a citizen and its country and a brain's and a sensation and a brain process, that the relationships are not exactly the same thing. No way. But what he is saying is you can kind of use this language to draw out the concepts to really get a feel for the what he's trying to say. So in both cases, the nations and their citizens, we can say that they have different semantic logic. In other words, the way that you describe nations doesn't really easily translate into the way that you describe citizens. An example which is really good in the textbook is you're saying, you know, China is a very powerful state. That's how you describe the nation. But you wouldn't say every single citizen is powerful in China. The language and the logic used to describe one is very different from the language and the logic used to describe the other, right? So from a point of view of semantics, you're going to have a different language. But from the point of view of ontology, it's the same, i.e. the citizens make up the nation. In fact, the best way to think about the ontological difference is that you're just seeing two sides of the same coin. You know, you've got the heads and the tails, which are the different experiences, which is basically, sorry, I shouldn't say experience, which is sensation versus brain processes. But they belong to the same thing, so they are the same thing ontologically. You just see it from one side or the other side. So that is basically what he's concluding about the identity thesis. Semantically different, but ontologically the same. All right, take some notes. Okay, so the reading should be pretty simple now. It's not really that much. Let's quickly go through it. Why should not sensations just be processes of a certain sort? There are, of course, well-known as well as lesser-known philosophical objections to the view that reports of sensations are reports of brain processes, but I shall try to argue that these arguments are by no means as cogent. Now remember, cogent means inductively well-structured arguments, so are by no means as cogent as is commonly thought to be the case. Let me first try to state more accurately the thesis that sensations are brain processes. It is not the thesis that, for example, after image or the ache means the same as brain process of sort X, where X is replaced by any description of a sort of brain process. It is that insofar as after image or ache is a report of a process. Notice he's using that keyword report, he uses it a lot. After image or ache is a report, and the reason why it's really important to think about how he uses report is that it's a way of describing a phenomena from one particular type of language or one particular type of logic. Okay? Take a note. It is that insofar as after image or ache is a report of a process, it is a report of a process that happens to be a brain process. It's just one way of reporting it. It follows that the thesis does not claim that sensation statements can be translated into statements about brain processes. And this is where he's referring to the semantic difference between the two. So you can't easily translate the statement of your sensation into the brain process. It's just not that easy now. Nor does it claim that the logic of a sensation statement is the same as that of brain process statements. Take a note. He's just clearly said it. You can't easily translate it, and you can't say the logic is the same either. Take a note. All it claims is that insofar as a sensation statement, it is a report of something, that something is in fact a brain process. So I'm just using a different language to describe a brain process. Likewise, if I'm describing the brain process, I'm using another language to describe the brain process. Semantically different, but ontologically the same. Take a note. Sensations are nothing over and above brain processes. Nations are nothing over and above citizens. That's what we said there about China. Remember the example? You can use nations and citizens. They are ontologically the same, but we use different language to describe them. But this does not prevent the logic of nation statements being very different from the logic of citizen statements, nor does it ensure the translatability of nation statements into citizen statements. So that's what we said in the summary above. I do not, however, wish to assert that the relation of sensation statements to brain process statements is very like that of nation statements to citizen statements. So he's saying, look, a nation's relationship to its citizens is very different from a relationship between sensations and brain processes. But it's a good analogy to help you illustrate the point that there is semantic difference, though ontological identity. All right? Nations do not just happen to be nothing over and above citizens. For example, I bring in the nations example merely to make a negative point, that the fact that the logic of A statements is different from B statements does not ensure that A's are anything over and above B's. So that last thing in bracket really makes sense. What he's trying to say is that just because I use one logic to describe one side of the coin and another logic to describe another side of the coin doesn't mean that they are two separate things, right? We're effectively talking about the same ontological entity, which is the coin. So the coin's a really good analogy to get what he's talking about when he talks about semantic difference, but ontological sameness, okay? Make sure you take some notes. So what have we done today? Well, we've explored how Smart positively develops his identity theory thesis. He's not saying this is what it is not, he's saying this is what it is. We've easily defined key terms. We should be in our skull, it should be pretty clear that this is a this is what I mean in the term of sorry, my brain just had a bit of a lapse there. This is what I mean in terms of semantic identity or semantic difference, sorry. And this is what I mean in terms of ontological sameness. All right, those two key terms should be right there in your skull, never to go away. We also have seen the visual summary, and we know that the visual summary backed up our reading, and the reading this time was pretty clearly aligned with our summary, which is very, very good. All right, so let's move on to the exam-like question. And now you'd understand why I got you to draw a picture of Australia, because again, it goes to that conclusion that he wants to make. He says A statements are different from B statements in terms of their logic. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that A is different from B. It's just a different way of reporting it. All right, cheers.